Captain Leela Dawson stepped onto the parade field with a steady rhythm, the heat of the morning sun bouncing off her polished boots. The air buzzed with anticipation, the metallic scent of brass and sweat mingling as 282 soldiers stood at attention, waiting. Their faces reflected respect, curiosity, and skepticism in equal measure. Leela could read them all in a glance. Every nervous fidget, every square jaw, every hesitant posture. She didn't flinch. She had been through worse. Much worse. At 34, she carried the weight of countless missions, midnight extractions, and decisions that had meant the difference between life and death. Yet somehow, to the eyes of her peers and superiors, she was still the quiet one, the one who never made a scene, the one who didn't boast, the one who just did. Today, that quiet would be tested. Today, Captain Dawson was taking command of a battalion, an entire unit of 282 men and women who had heard whispers about her reputation, but had never truly seen her in action. Many of them were wondering silently, can she handle this? Major Grant Keller, standing near the front, did not have doubts, at least, not in the right direction. He had been watching her career with a mix of disdain and irritation, the way a rival watches someone outperform them at every step. To him, Leela Dawson was a threat not because of her competence but because of what she represented, a woman who had achieved more than most men in her field and did so without seeking validation. Keller leaned slightly toward Lieutenant Harris, a young officer beside him, and muttered under his breath, "Watch her choke. She's not ready for this." His smirk was predatory, an almost palpable challenge aimed at her before she even turned her gaze toward the formation. But Leela heard him. She always did. She had trained herself to notice the subtleties, the way a foot taps impatiently, a hand clenches, a voice carries hidden hostility. Every subtle sign in Keller's behavior screamed arrogance and underestimation, and she would use that. The battalion sergeant major approached, a towering figure whose presence alone silenced murmurs across the field. "Captain Dawson," he said, handing her the unit colors, the flag that symbolized the honor, unity, and authority of the battalion. Her fingers brushed the fabric lightly, feeling the weight of responsibility, the gravity of leadership resting in her hands. She straightened, adjusting her uniform with deliberate precision. Keller's eyes narrowed. He stepped forward, uninvited, placing himself squarely in her path. "You really think you're ready for this?" His voice was low but carried enough to reach the soldiers nearby. A ripple of unease passed through the formation, some standing a little taller, some whispering behind their hands. Leela tilted her head slightly, her expression neutral, almost disappointed. To her, Keller's aggression wasn't a surprise, it was predictable. But his timing, his lack of awareness, made him reckless. "Major Keller," she said calmly, "step back. You're in my line of command." The words carried authority, but Keller didn't move. Instead, he stepped closer, his jaw tightening. "Do you really think this battalion is yours, that they'll follow a woman like you?" The question landed like a slap, not physically, but in the charged tension radiating across the field. Some soldiers shifted uneasily. Others, fists clenched instinctively, ready to step in. The heat of confrontation was rising, and no one quite knew how far it would go. Leela took a breath, her gaze sweeping over the battalion. She saw the hesitation in their eyes, the weight of expectation. And she knew something crucial. Today wasn't about proving herself to Keller. It was about showing 282 soldiers what leadership looked like under pressure. The wind stirred, catching the edges of the flags and snapping them crisply. Every detail of the formation, the precision of uniforms, the gleam of boots, the rigid postures of soldiers, felt suddenly like a stage set for what was about to happen. And in the center of it all, Keller was a looming storm, unaware that the person in front of him was more prepared for combat than he would ever be. Then it happened. Keller leaned in, his movement aggressive and sudden, invading her space. "You're going to regret this, Dawson," he whispered sharply, but loud enough for a few nearby soldiers to hear. The words were a threat, deliberate and personal, aimed to provoke fear or hesitation. But Leela didn't hesitate. Not for a second. Her posture remained impeccable, her eyes locked on his. She could feel the energy radiating off him, frustration, rage, disbelief that she hadn't flinched, that she hadn't faltered. He was a man used to being obeyed, to having control, and yet here he was face to face with someone who would not be intimidated. The tension on the field was electric. Soldiers held their breath, sensing that the calm before the storm was about to shatter. Some shifted on their heels. Some tightened their grip on their rifles out of instinct, though nothing yet required them to act. Even the air felt thicker, as though it had been drawn in and held, waiting for the inevitable spark. Keller raised his voice, louder now, a dangerous edge creeping into every syllable. "Do you really think you're ready to command this battalion? You're just a—" Before he could finish, Leela's hand moved, not in fear, not in hesitation, but with deliberate precision. She stepped slightly forward, closing the small space between them, her presence asserting itself over his. The formation seemed to hold its collective breath. "You are under my command now, Major," she said, her tone ice-cold, unwavering. "And you will not threaten me or this battalion." Keller's eyes widened for the briefest instant. Shock, confusion, and disbelief mingled in a single expression. His next move was a fumble of rage. A swing of his arm aimed directly at her shoulder, intended to intimidate, perhaps even to strike. But Leela was ready. Years of hand-to-hand combat, of field training, of split-second reactions, coalesced in a single, fluid motion. She caught his wrist mid-swing, her grip like steel, her stance perfectly balanced. The sound of uniforms creaking, the metallic shine of badges, and the murmur of 282 soldiers watching intently made it all feel cinematic, suspended in slow motion. Keller froze, the motion halted by Leela's unyielding hand. The formation was silent. Every soldier's eyes were fixed on them, some in shock, some in awe. Leela tilted her head, meeting his gaze directly. "You just assaulted a commanding officer," she said, the words sharp, deliberate, and full of authority. For a moment the world seemed to stop. Soldiers blinked, unsure whether to move, speak, or intervene. Keller's face turned red with fury and humiliation, and yet through it all Leela remained calm, a pillar of control in the eye of a storm. The tension was unbearable. Every second stretched, every heartbeat amplified. The soldiers knew, without a single word, that this moment would define not only the battalion's future but Leela Dawson's as well. And as the silence stretched, Leela's lips curved slightly, not a smile but a promise. A promise that she would not be intimidated, not today, not ever. The entire battalion held its breath, waiting. Waiting to see what Major Keller would do next. And Leela, she didn't blink. Not once. Major Grant Keller's mind was a whirlwind of anger, humiliation, and disbelief. The sharp words from Captain Leela Dawson, the unflinching stare, the way she had stopped him mid-attack. It was as if every ounce of control he thought he had was stripped away in a single, humiliating instant. He had never been confronted like this before, and he certainly had never been stopped. The sun bore down on the parade field, highlighting every crease in his uniform, every tight clench of his fists. Around him, 282 soldiers stood frozen, eyes darting between the two officers. The murmurs had stopped. The formation was holding its collective breath, sensing the tension that threatened to explode. Keller's pride, fragile and towering, was teetering dangerously close to collapse. He was brilliant in the field, trained to react with lethal precision. Yet here, in the middle of a formation, all that skill meant nothing. Leela's calm, measured control over him in that moment made him feel powerless, like a rookie in a fight he couldn't win. Every instinct screamed to lash out, to regain authority, to make her fear him. But every instinct that might have saved him had been neutralized by her single, fluid movement. You think this is some kind of game?" he barked, stepping closer again, a twitch in his jaw betraying his inner fury. His words were sharp, his voice low, carrying just enough threat to make anyone nearby wary. Soldiers instinctively shifted in place. Some gripped their rifles, others clenched their fists. Leela Dawson remained motionless, her hand still subtly controlling the space between them. Every soldier in the formation could see her poise, her unshakable focus. Her eyes didn't waver. Her breathing was steady. Her presence radiated command, and yet to Keller it was infuriating. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't intimidated. And that made him feel smaller than he had in years. "Major," she said calmly, "step back, you're on my ground. You are under my command now." The words cut deeper than any insult. For Keller, authority had always been about intimidation, about asserting dominance through presence and, if necessary, physical assertion. Leela had rendered both useless. She had taken control without raising her voice, without even lifting a finger aggressively. And that, more than anything, made him snap. In a flash of rage, Keller lunged, swinging his arm at her. Not a calculated attack, but a desperate attempt to reclaim some shred of dominance. His motion was fast, reckless, and entirely predictable to anyone trained to read combat. Soldiers around them flinched, some instinctively stepping forward. Leela's reaction was immediate. Years of combat, training in combatives, and a lifetime of preparing for moments like this crystallized in an instinctual response. She moved, not defensively but decisively, catching his wrist mid-swing, twisting his arm slightly. The move was precise, textbook, and utterly devastating in its effectiveness. Keller's eyes widened. Time seemed to slow. The air was charged with tension as he realized he had underestimated her. The swing that was supposed to assert dominance had been neutralized, and now his own body betrayed him. He could feel the strain in his elbow, the unnatural torque in his wrist, the sudden vulnerability of being caught by someone he thought he could easily intimidate. You don't know who you're dealing with," he snarled, his voice cracking, a mixture of fury and panic. "I know exactly who you are," Leela replied evenly, her grip unwavering. "You just assaulted a commanding officer. That is not acceptable, Major Keller." The words reverberated across the formation. Soldiers were frozen in disbelief, some exchanging wide-eyed glances. Others, the ones who had long suspected Keller's temper and arrogance, felt a mix of satisfaction and tension. They were witnessing history unfold, a moment that would be remembered in battalion lore for years. Keller struggled, thrashing slightly, attempting to free himself, but Leela had anticipated every move. With a smooth, almost elegant rotation of her body, she stepped behind him and applied a controlled arm bar, using his momentum against him. The precision was astonishing. Soldiers trained in combatives couldn't suppress a collective gasp. Some pressed their hands to their mouths. Then came the sound that would echo through the barracks, a sharp, unmistakable crack. Keller collapsed to his knees, his face contorted in pain. The armbar had worked perfectly, and his elbow or wrist, no one could immediately tell which, was now broken. Leela didn't celebrate. She didn't gloat. Her stance remained calm, commanding, controlled. "Medic," she called, her voice slicing through the stunned silence like a blade. 4 medics sprinted across the field, sliding to a stop at Keller's side. They immediately began attending to him, assessing the damage, while Leela's gaze swept across the battalion. Every soldier was watching, some in awe, some in disbelief, some with suppressed admiration. It was more than a physical victory. It was a statement. Leela Dawson was not to be underestimated. She had neutralized the major in seconds, in front of 282 soldiers, with the precision of a combat veteran and the authority of a born leader. But victory came with its own complications. While Keller writhed on the grass, groaning in pain, the formation remained tense. Lieutenant Colonel Briggs, Keller's mentor and protector, had stormed across the parade field with fury etched into every line of his face. He had witnessed the entire scene from the edge of the formation, and his eyes now burned with a mixture of shock and rage. "What the hell is going on here?" Briggs shouted, his voice cutting through the air. Soldiers stiffened at the sharpness of his tone, unsure of whether to intervene. Leela's posture remained impeccable. She didn't flinch, she didn't step back. "Sir," she said evenly, Major Keller assaulted me in front of the battalion. I defended myself in accordance with military regulation and training." Briggs' nostrils flared and he leaned closer, his face twisted with indignation. "You embarrassed an officer in front of the battalion. Do you have any idea what you've done?" Leela tilted her head, her expression calm but unwavering. "He embarrassed himself, sir. I simply stopped the assault before it escalated further." The formation was silent, every soldier holding their breath. Some glanced at each other, seeing for the first time the kind of authority and courage their captain possessed. Others were still in shock at what had just occurred. Briggs turned sharply on the battalion sergeant major, his voice lowering, venom dripping from every word. "And you," he barked, "why are you standing there? This woman—" "That's enough, sir," the sergeant major interrupted, his voice booming over Briggs' own. His gaze was sharp, unwavering, and filled with authority earned over decades. Captain Dawson did exactly what she needed to do. She stopped an assault on a commanding officer. That is not just acceptable, it is commendable. Briggs' jaw twitched. His fury was barely contained. But before he could respond, his radio crackled with urgent communication from command. The expression on his face changed instantly, fury mixed with apprehension. The storm was far from over, but it was clear that someone higher up was now watching, observing the entire situation unfold. Keller, still on his knees, groaning in pain, looked up at Lila, disbelief etched across his face. He had miscalculated. He had assumed intimidation, physicality, and rank would be enough to dominate her. He had been utterly wrong. And Leela Dawson. She stood tall, her uniform crisp, her eyes steady, a calm fury radiating from her. She had just proven to 282 soldiers in a single, unforgettable moment that she was not someone to be toyed with. She was a leader, she was a warrior, and she would not be struck. The formation remained tense, charged, alive with the aftershocks of the confrontation. The battalion would remember this moment for years, not just for the physical clash, but for the unshakable presence of a woman who refused to yield to intimidation or fear. And as the medics helped Keller to his feet, the soldiers knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning. What happened next could change everything for Captain Dawson, and for every officer who thought they could challenge her authority. The sharp crack of Major Keller's arm echoed across the parade field, bouncing off the barracks and cutting through the morning air like a gunshot. Soldiers instinctively recoiled, eyes widening in shock, jaws dropping as the reality of what had just happened sank in. The man who had always projected invincibility, the officer who had built his career on authority and intimidation, was now crumpled to the ground in pain, held in a position of complete vulnerability by a woman they had, until moments ago, underestimated. Captain Leela Dawson didn't gloat. She didn't shout. She didn't even flinch. Years of combat had taught her that mastery of a situation wasn't shown through fury but through control. Every muscle in her body remained steady, her breathing calm, her stance a perfect balance of authority and readiness. She called out firmly, "Medic," her voice carrying across the silent formation like a blade through fog. 4 medics sprinted across the field, skidding to Keller's side. Their training kicked in instantly, assessing his arm, stabilizing him, and preparing to remove him from the field. But the soldiers didn't move. They were frozen, witnessing a scene they knew would become legend. Captain Dawson, calm and commanding, standing over a major who had tried to dominate her. Keller's face contorted in pain, mixed with fury and disbelief. He had never expected resistance, let alone mastery. Every instinct he had relied on, intimidation, experience, brute force, had failed spectacularly. And now, with his arm broken and his authority publicly humiliated, he was at her mercy in front of the entire battalion. The soldiers' murmurs rose quietly like a ripple across water. A private whispered to another, Did she just break his arm?" The other nodded, eyes wide. The scene was unreal. Some younger soldiers, still fresh from training, exchanged glances of awe and fear. They had all heard about Leela Dawson, but seeing her act in real time, stopping an aggressive major mid-assault, was something entirely different. Lieutenant Colonel Briggs, who had been standing off to the side, stormed forward, his face red with fury. His strides were long, aggressive, calculated. He had witnessed every detail, from Keller's initial attack to the precise control Leela had exerted. His jaw tightened as he approached her. "What in God's name is going on here?" he barked, his voice filled with rage and disbelief. Soldiers instinctively stepped aside, forming a path, some unsure whether to intervene. Leela remained motionless, composed as ever. "Sir," she said, her tone even and deliberate, "Major Keller assaulted me in front of the battalion. I acted to neutralize the threat in accordance with military regulations." Briggs' nostrils flared. His lips pressed into a tight line as he leaned forward, close enough for her to feel his heat. "You embarrassed an officer in front of 282 soldiers. Do you have any idea what you've done?" Leela's gaze didn't waver. "He embarrassed himself, sir. I prevented further escalation, that is all." The battalion remained silent, the tension so thick it was almost visible. Soldiers shifted uneasily, yet many felt a swelling sense of pride, realizing they were witnessing a commander acting with the kind of courage and authority that textbooks could only describe. Others were still in shock, their minds racing to process the audacity of the moment. Briggs spun toward the battalion sergeant major, his anger barely contained. "And you, why are you standing there? You're supposed to enforce discipline." The sergeant major didn't flinch. His eyes, hard as flint, met Briggs with an unspoken command of their own. "Captain Dawson acted decisively to defend herself," he said, his voice loud and unwavering. "This is not a matter of embarrassment. It is a matter of upholding the integrity of the battalion. She did exactly what was required." Briggs' face twitched with rage, his control slipping. For a moment, it seemed he might escalate the situation further, but then his radio crackled, a sharp, urgent call from command. The expression on his face shifted from anger to alarm. The eyes that had burned with fury were now scanning the horizon, realizing that the higher-ups were watching, and that the consequences of this incident were far from contained. Keller, still on his knees and clutching his injured arm, could only stare at Leela. Every ounce of arrogance, every shred of superiority he had relied upon, was gone. He had misjudged her completely, and now he was paying the price in front of the entire battalion. Pain shot through his arm, but it was the humiliation that cut deeper. For the first time in his career, he felt powerless. The soldiers' reactions were varied. Some whispered in awe, "She's incredible." Others muttered, "I wouldn't want to face her in a fight." A few younger soldiers exchanged excited glances, already realizing that they would tell this story for years. The legend of Captain Leela Dawson was being born before their eyes, in a moment of raw authority and unshakable courage. Leela remained standing, surveying the battalion with calm, calculated authority. Every movement she made, every shift in her stance was deliberate. She didn't need to raise her voice or strike again. The point had been made. Her control over the situation was absolute. Briggs, realizing he had lost the immediate moral high ground, began to fume silently. His mind raced through scenarios, consequences, and narratives, all of which painted Leela as a dangerous, unpredictable element in the chain of command, one he could not simply dismiss or control. His eyes flicked from her to Keller, whose groans of pain reminded him that the incident was no longer theoretical. The medics carefully lifted Keller, stabilizing his broken arm as they prepared to move him off the parade field. He gritted his teeth, rage and humiliation warring with the physical agony of the injury. Soldiers stepped aside, watching silently as the man who had once seemed untouchable was escorted away, leaving Leela standing tall at the center of the formation. And then the unexpected happened. The battalion sergeant major, who had remained silent until now, stepped forward, his voice booming across the parade ground. "This battalion has just witnessed an act of courage, discipline, and decisive leadership. Captain Dawson did not humiliate this unit. She protected it, and she protected every soldier standing here today. A ripple of acknowledgement moved through the formation. Soldiers straightened, some nodding in agreement, others simply staring in stunned respect. The moment had shifted. What could have been a day of scandal, humiliation, and confrontation had become a powerful demonstration of leadership under pressure. Yet even as the tension began to settle, a new wave of unease swept across the parade field. Lieutenant Colonel Briggs turned away, speaking sharply into his radio. Something was happening. An intervention from higher command was imminent. The mood of the soldiers shifted from awe to suspense, realizing that while this confrontation had ended, the consequences were far from over. Leela exhaled slowly, her body relaxing only slightly. She had proven herself in the most immediate, visceral way possible. She had defended her authority, her dignity, and her command in front of hundreds of soldiers. And yet, she knew this was just the beginning. The broken arm of Keller was only the first chapter in a battle that would involve politics, hierarchy, and scrutiny from every level of military command. The scene of the arm breaking, the physical display of mastery and courage, would be remembered. But the next steps would test not only her skill, but her ability to navigate the treacherous waters of military bureaucracy. As Keller was escorted away, his groans filling the air, the soldiers' whispers turned to speculation. "What's going to happen next?" one asked. Another replied, "Colonel Briggs isn't going to let this go." Leela's gaze swept across the formation once more. Her heart raced, not from fear but from anticipation. She knew the storm was coming. Higher-ups would be involved. Accusations, investigations, and politics would attempt to twist the truth. But she also knew that she had the most important thing on her side: integrity, skill, and the undeniable truth that she had acted in defense of herself and her battalion. And then, from the corner of her eye, she noticed him, Colonel Briggs, storming back toward her with fury in his step. The expression on his face was unreadable, but the tension radiating from him promised that the confrontation was far from over. The battalion watched, collectively holding its breath, as the next chapter of this confrontation loomed, a chapter that would test not just Leela's combat skills, but her leadership, her resolve, and her ability to survive the politics of power in the military. The arm had been broken, the pride of a major shattered, but the real storm was only just beginning. The moment Lieutenant Colonel Briggs reached Captain Leela Dawson, the air around them seemed to crackle with tension. He stormed across the parade field, his polished boots striking the concrete like drumbeats announcing war. His face was flushed, eyes narrowed, every line etched with a dangerous mix of rage and disbelief. Every soldier who watched knew this was no longer about the minor chaos of an arm being broken. It was about power, hierarchy, and pride. Briggs stopped mere feet from her, chest rising and falling as though he had been running a marathon instead of marching a few steps. His uniform, pristine moments ago, now seemed to mirror the fury and agitation rippling through his body. "What in God's name do you think you're doing, Captain?" he barked, voice sharp enough to send several soldiers recoiling instinctively. Leela's posture was impeccable, her back straight, shoulders squared. Her calm demeanor contrasted sharply with Briggs' volatile energy, and she knew exactly how he worked. He thrived on intimidation, on bending people through sheer force of presence. But this was different. She was no longer a subordinate in a situation he could control. She had authority now, earned in moments of precision, skill, and courage that he had neither anticipated nor respected. "Sir," she replied, her voice even, steady, yet carrying an unmistakable authority that silenced any murmurs from the battalion behind them, "Major Keller assaulted me. I acted to neutralize the threat and protect this battalion. That is all." Briggs' nostrils flared, his lips pressing into a thin line. "You humiliated an officer, in front of 282 soldiers. Do you realize what you've done?" His voice cracked under the weight of fury, the embarrassment of his protégé's broken arm, and the fear that he himself might now face scrutiny. Leela met his glare without flinching. He humiliated himself, sir. I prevented escalation. I upheld the regulations. That is all. A tense silence fell across the parade field. Soldiers exchanged glances, many holding back surprise at the courage displayed by their captain. Others, the ones who had long suspected Briggs' volatility, watched with quiet satisfaction. The battalion was witnessing history, not just a confrontation, but the birth of leadership forged under pressure. Briggs pivoted sharply, spinning toward the battalion's sergeant major, his eyes blazing. "And you? What are you doing, standing there like a statue while this chaos unfolds?" The sergeant major, a towering man with decades of experience etched into the lines of his face, did not flinch. He stepped forward, his voice steady, resonant, carrying authority that matched and in some ways surpassed Briggs'. "Captain Dawson acted decisively to defend herself," he said. "This is not about embarrassment. It is about integrity and leadership. She did what was required and protected this unit. End of discussion." Briggs' jaw twitched, a subtle but dangerous sign of suppressed rage. He had been trained to command, to dominate, to intimidate through authority and presence. But here, in front of his battalion, his power had been neutralized in an instant. The humiliation he felt was visceral, and it burned hotter than the sun overhead. "Do you even realize the consequences?" he hissed, leaning in close to Leela. "You've undermined authority. You've embarrassed the chain of command." Leela's response was simple, yet devastating in its effect. "Authority is earned, sir. I did not undermine it. I demonstrated what true command looks like." The words landed like a physical blow. Soldiers around them exchanged glances, many nodding subtly, the first real spark of collective respect for their captain igniting. Briggs' face reddened further, veins protruding at his temples. His frustration was now almost palpable, a storm contained within the rigid lines of his uniform. Suddenly, his radio crackled, urgent and insistent. Briggs' expression shifted almost imperceptibly from fury to unease. Whatever message came through had the power to sway the entire course of what was unfolding. The higher command was paying attention. Briggs' authority, which had seemed untouchable, was now under scrutiny. Keller, still seated on the edge of the field with his arm supported by medics, glared at Leela with a mix of pain, rage, and humiliation. The man who had once believed he could intimidate and dominate her was now reduced to an image of failure, visible to all who stood on the parade field. His growls of discomfort punctuated the tense atmosphere, a reminder of the physical reality of what had just occurred. Leela's gaze swept across the formation, measuring reactions, noting the subtle changes in posture and expression. Soldiers were no longer hesitant. There was recognition in their eyes, a dawning awareness of the caliber of their leader. The formation, previously tense and uncertain, now held a new kind of respect for her. The captain who had diffused an assault with skill and composure was not just capable, she was extraordinary. Briggs, unable to contain his fury, spun to leave, but then paused mid-step, glancing over his shoulder. His eyes met Leela's. There was a subtle but clear message in that gaze. This confrontation was far from over. The battle lines were drawn, not just for respect, but for survival in the treacherous waters of military hierarchy. The battalion remained on edge. Soldiers whispered in hushed tones, "What will happen next? How will the colonel respond? Will this end in reprisal?" The questions hung in the air, unanswered, heightening the tension and suspense. Leela exhaled, a quiet but deliberate release of controlled energy. She had faced combat, survived ambushes, and navigated chaos in hostile environments, but this confrontation within the rigid rules of military authority was different. Here, skill alone would not suffice. Diplomacy, foresight, and an unshakable sense of integrity were required. She knew that Briggs would not let the incident fade. He would escalate, manipulate, and use every ounce of influence to regain control and protect his protégé. Yet she also knew something else. The battalion had witnessed her in action. They had seen her courage, her composure, her unflinching command. And once trust was earned in a situation like this, it could not be easily undone. The medics finished stabilizing Keller and helped him to his feet, guiding him off the parade field. His arm, now securely in a cast, was a stark symbol of the reversal of power that had occurred in moments. He glared at Leela one final time, a silent promise of revenge or retaliation burning in his eyes. Briggs, finally retreating to consult with his officers, muttered under his breath, but Leela caught enough to understand his intent. This was not over. Every step he took, every strategy he would deploy in the coming days, would be aimed at undermining her, discrediting her, or punishing her for the humiliation he had suffered. Yet Leela remained calm. She had faced danger in foreign lands, had survived the chaos of combat zones, and had outmaneuvered opponents far deadlier than a frustrated colonel. What she faced now was merely another form of battle, one requiring patience, strategy, and unwavering confidence. The battalion began to shift, the tension easing as the spectacle concluded. Soldiers whispered among themselves, some nodding in approval, others shaking their heads in disbelief. What they had witnessed was not just a clash of authority, it was a lesson in leadership, composure, and skill. And yet, even as the field slowly emptied, the shadow of what was coming loomed large. Colonel Briggs would not relent. Keller would not forget. The hierarchy of command was fragile, and battles for power were often won in the shadows, away from the eyes of soldiers. Leela Dawson knew she had survived the first wave, but the storm was only gathering. The higher command would soon weigh in, investigations would begin, and whispers in the corridors of power would threaten to distort the truth of what had occurred. She adjusted her uniform, straightened her posture, and exhaled. Every soldier who had witnessed the events today now understood something essential. Leela Dawson was a leader, a warrior, and someone who could not be intimidated, diminished, or controlled. And as the last echoes of Briggs' boots faded across the parade field, the air thick with tension and uncertainty, Leela knew the real battle had only just begun. The arm had been broken, authority had been challenged, respect had been earned. But the political storm was coming, and it would test not just her skill and courage, but her ability to navigate the intricate, dangerous world of military power. The fight for command had begun, and 282 soldiers were watching. By the next morning, the base was buzzing. Word of the previous day's events had spread like wildfire. Major Keller's broken arm, Captain Leela Dawson's flawless defense, and the colonel's explosive confrontation had everyone talking. Some whispered with awe, others with skepticism, and a few with barely concealed anger. Rumors, half-truths, and speculation swirled through the mess halls, corridors, and barracks, creating a tense, almost electric atmosphere. Leela Dawson moved through it all with practiced calm. She adjusted her uniform, kept her gaze steady, and projected the same unflinching authority that had allowed her to survive yesterday. Her soldiers watched her closely, some still in awe, others quietly reassured by her presence. The tension of the previous day had shifted into a quiet, anticipatory suspense. Everyone knew this was far from over. Her office door clicked open, and two officers in plain dress uniforms entered. They introduced themselves as investigators from the base command, an official presence that meant the incident had escalated beyond the battalion, beyond the parade field, and into the hierarchy where consequences could be severe. "Captain Dawson," one of them began, a stern-faced officer with sharp eyes and a clipped tone, "we are here to investigate the events that occurred yesterday on the parade field involving Major Keller." Leela nodded, keeping her composure. "Yes, sir, I will cooperate fully." The investigators' eyes flicked to each other briefly, a silent acknowledgement that this was going to be a high-stakes examination. They had heard the initial reports, but witnessing her composure firsthand would give them an immediate sense of her credibility, her poise, and her potential threat to anyone who tried to manipulate the narrative. They began their questioning methodically, starting with the standard inquiries. What happened, how it happened, who was present. Leela recounted the events with precision, her words concise but vivid. Keller's aggressive advance, the attempted assault, the controlled response that resulted in a broken arm, and the sequence of events that followed. Every detail was accurate, every action explained, and every decision justified according to protocol. The investigators exchanged subtle glances, noting her calm demeanor. And the battalion's reaction? One asked, pen poised. They observed my actions, Leela replied evenly. There was no escalation beyond my control. Every soldier maintained discipline throughout the incident. The battalion's integrity was upheld. The investigators scribbled notes, occasionally exchanging quiet whispers. Leela sensed their thoughts, their caution, their attempt to separate fact from rumor, their instinctive wariness of a situation that had grown volatile so quickly. She met their scrutiny head-on, unwavering, demonstrating not just her skill but her mental fortitude. Then the inevitable question came, sharp and pointed. Major Keller alleges he was assaulted. Your actions caused him physical harm. How do you justify this? Leela's eyes didn't waver. He attempted to strike me in front of 282 soldiers. I neutralized the threat to prevent further escalation. The result was an injury sustained due to his aggression. It is not only justified, it is consistent with military regulations regarding defense of oneself and command authority. The room was silent for a moment. The investigators scribbled furiously, then one of them finally spoke. And Colonel Briggs, he claims that you undermined his authority and embarrassed the chain of command. I did not undermine anyone's authority, Leela said firmly. I upheld the integrity of the battalion, protected its members, and enforced the chain of command as required by regulation. His perception of embarrassment is irrelevant to the facts. Actions, not feelings, are what matter in leadership and military discipline. The officers exchanged another glance, their expressions unreadable. Leela had anticipated this reaction. Briggs' personal vendetta would likely color the narrative, and she knew navigating the politics of military bureaucracy would be more treacherous than any field operation she had ever faced. But she also knew that clarity, precision, and unshakable confidence were her strongest weapons. The investigation continued, with Leela answering every question with factual clarity, never wavering, never raising her voice, and never showing fear. She provided diagrams, recounted every movement, and explained every decision in meticulous detail. Her mastery of both combat and leadership was evident not just in what she did on the parade field, but in how she explained it, every word deliberate, measured, and persuasive. Outside the office, soldiers whispered nervously. Some speculated that the higher-ups might punish her to appease Briggs. Others quietly hoped that her professionalism and integrity would shield her. Everyone knew this was bigger than a personal feud. It was a test of justice, leadership, and the integrity of the military system itself. Hours passed. The investigators left, promising to review their notes and deliver their recommendations. Leela exhaled quietly. She had survived the immediate confrontation, but she knew that politics, influence, and hidden agendas could be just as lethal as physical threats. She prepared herself for the next wave, knowing that what had begun as a single clash on the parade field was now a full-blown storm. Later that day, Keller was brought back to the base under strict supervision. His broken arm was carefully immobilized, but his glare at Leela was unmistakable. There was rage, humiliation, and a simmering desire for revenge in every glance he gave her. He muttered under his breath, words meant to wound, but Leela met them with an unflinching stare. His threats would not intimidate her. They had lost all power the moment he had raised his hand against her. Briggs, meanwhile, convened a private meeting with several senior officers. His voice was measured, but his words carried the unmistakable tone of someone seeking retribution. This incident cannot be ignored, he said, packing the room. We must protect the integrity of command. Dawson's actions, while technically justified, have set a dangerous precedent. A seasoned colonel responded cautiously. "With all due respect, sir, she acted within regulations. She prevented escalation, protected the unit, and neutralized a direct threat. The soldiers witnessed competence and leadership." Briggs' eyes flashed. "Competence or not, we cannot allow this kind of insubordination to stand. Command must be respected. If we allow one officer to humiliate another, we risk chaos." Leela, unaware of the exact details of the meeting, sensed the growing storm. The day's events had only been the beginning. Investigators had assessed her actions, soldiers had witnessed her skill and courage, but the chain of command was a treacherous arena. Every decision would be scrutinized, every word twisted, and Briggs would use every ounce of influence at his disposal to undermine her authority. By nightfall, tension on the base was palpable. Soldiers whispered quietly in the barracks, some questioning what the next day would bring. Would higher command side with Briggs and Keller? Would the battalion's trust in their captain be tested by bureaucratic politics? Or would Leela Dawson's integrity and skill shield her from those seeking to punish her for defending herself? She sat alone in her office, reviewing the events of the day, her mind sharp and focused. The parade field had tested her courage and her skill. The investigation had tested her composure and clarity. But now, she realized, the real test was about to begin. Navigating the dangerous, unseen world of military politics, where perception could be manipulated and decisions could be twisted to serve the ambitions of others. As she gazed out the window at the parade field, still echoing with the memory of yesterday's confrontation, she knew one thing with absolute certainty: she would not yield. She had faced physical danger before and survived. Now, she would face political and bureaucratic storms, and she would meet them with the same unwavering resolve that had allowed her to stand unflinching in front of Major Keller, Colonel Briggs, and 282 soldiers. The battalion, the base, and the higher command all waited, each in suspense. Leela Dawson had survived the first wave, but the next wave was coming, and it would test not her combat skill, but her mind, her strategy, and her courage like never before. The morning sun barely filtered through the blinds of Captain Leela Dawson's office, casting thin, harsh lines across the polished floor. She sat behind her desk, reviewing the report she had drafted for the investigators, her mind sharpening with every line. Yesterday's confrontation had left a mark on the battalion, the colonel, and, indirectly, the base itself. But what worried her most was not the physical threat she had neutralized. It was the storm now gathering in the corridors of power. Lieutenant Colonel Briggs was not a man to let an affront pass. Leela knew him well: cunning, ambitious, and willing to bend rules when it suited him. He had already begun plotting his counterstrike, and she had every reason to believe that what came next would test not her combat skills, but her political and strategic acumen. The first sign came in the form of a summons, a formal request from higher command for her presence in the central office of the base. The language was polite, almost sterile, but the subtext was unmistakable. Leela's pulse didn't quicken, but her mind immediately raced. Every officer on the base had experienced that kind of call before. It usually meant scrutiny, questioning, and a subtle, unspoken warning. Your career could end here. She walked onto the parade field one last time, letting her eyes scan the formation of soldiers who had witnessed her defiance. Their posture was straight, their eyes attentive, a quiet but unmistakable loyalty shining through. Many had already begun to see her not just as their captain, but as the embodiment of courage and integrity in the face of intimidation. That loyalty was her shield. Briggs was already waiting in the central office when she arrived, flanked by senior officers whose expressions ranged from neutral to subtly hostile. His eyes flicked to her with barely restrained contempt. "Captain Dawson," he said, his voice deceptively smooth, "please have a seat." Leela accepted the chair with calm precision. Her back was straight, her gaze unwavering. She knew this was a trap, a political maneuver disguised as a formal inquiry. Her mission now was to navigate it without faltering, without giving Briggs an opening to twist her words, and without compromising her authority. The questioning began carefully, with minor inquiries about protocol and sequence of events. Briggs' voice was measured, almost casual, but there was a lethal edge beneath every word. "Captain, it's been brought to my attention that Major Keller sustained an injury while under your supervision. Can you explain the circumstances in detail?" Leela recounted the events succinctly. Keller's aggressive approach, the assault attempt, the defense measures she took, and the precise control that prevented escalation. Her tone was professional, her words deliberate. She did not justify herself emotionally. She presented facts, evidence, and adherence to regulations. Briggs' eyes narrowed. He leaned forward, fingers steepled. "Captain, while I understand your explanation, some might argue that your response was excessive." His gaze sharpened, testing her reaction. "After all, you are commanding a battalion, not engaging in personal combat. Couldn't this have been handled differently?" Leela's response was precise, unwavering. "Sir, I prevented an assault on a commanding officer and protected the integrity of the battalion. Excessive force would have been measured, unnecessary, or reckless. My actions were proportional, defensive, and within the bounds of military regulation." A murmur of quiet approval passed through a junior officer sitting beside Briggs, but he ignored it. Briggs, sensing the lack of vulnerability in her demeanor, adjusted his approach. Now he began probing for weakness, innuendo, subtle accusations, and leading questions designed to make her falter. "Captain," he said, leaning back slightly, "some may perceive your actions as undermining morale. Soldiers witness the physical domination of a superior officer. How do you justify the effect this has on discipline?" Leela's eyes met his without hesitation. "Discipline is maintained through respect, not fear. Soldiers respect actions that demonstrate competence, courage, and integrity. I upheld the chain of command by enforcing proper conduct and neutralizing a threat. The battalion has already demonstrated cohesion and confidence in response to these events." The senior officers exchanged glances. Briggs, lips pressed into a thin line. He was accustomed to bending others with intimidation or authority, but here, in front of witnesses and higher command, his usual tactics faltered. Leela's composure was a weapon he could not counter with threats or manipulation alone. But he was not done. With careful precision, he shifted tactics, moving to more insidious territory. "Captain Dawson, we've also received reports that some soldiers have expressed admiration for your actions, possibly elevating your personal authority above that of established hierarchy. How do you respond to concerns that your influence may destabilize the chain of command?" Leela paused, considering her words carefully. "Sir, influence is not something granted by hierarchy alone. It is earned through actions, competence, and consistency. If soldiers respect leadership that prevents harm and maintains order, that reflects the values we should be cultivating, not undermining. I did not seek personal elevation. I acted in accordance with duty and regulation." There was a tense silence. Her answer was flawless, yet the room felt charged with anticipation. Briggs' jaw tightened. He could not openly contradict her without exposing his own agenda to scrutiny. But the trap had not been sprung yet. He had another, more subtle tool to use. Briggs leaned closer, voice lowering slightly. "Captain Dawson, you are aware that I have the support of several senior officers here. Their perspective is that your actions, while technically within regulation, have set a precedent that may challenge command structure in unforeseen ways. Are you prepared to accept the consequences if this escalates?" The words were loaded, thinly veiled threats masquerading as caution. Leela recognized the pattern instantly. Briggs was attempting to paint her as a threat to stability, to cast doubt on her leadership in a way that could justify disciplinary action or career damage. Her response was deliberate, measured, and uncompromising. "Sir, I am always prepared to accept the consequences of actions taken in adherence to regulations, for the protection of the battalion and the integrity of command. However, the facts are clear. My actions maintained order, neutralized a threat, and demonstrated effective leadership. Any consequences inconsistent with that reality would not reflect justice or proper command oversight. The room remained silent for a moment. Leela could sense the tension shifting. Briggs had no immediate counter, and the senior officers were clearly reassessing the situation. The trap had been laid, but she had navigated it with precision, leaving the aggressor momentarily exposed. But Leela knew better than to relax. She had survived the field, diffused a physical assault, and now navigated bureaucratic threats. But Briggs would escalate. He would appeal, manipulate, and scheme to regain control. The investigation was only the first move in a larger game, one that could affect her career, her authority, and the battalion's trust in her. She left the meeting with her head held high, her mind already planning the next steps. She would reinforce her position, gather documentation, and ensure that the battalion's loyalty remained steadfast. She could anticipate Briggs' moves, but she could not control them entirely. What she could control was her own response, calm, precise, and unyielding. Outside, soldiers watched her leave the office. Whispers followed her down the corridor, admiration, speculation, awe. She had survived the field, the assault, and the first stage of bureaucratic scrutiny. But the storm was far from over. The political battlefield was treacherous, and Briggs' influence would not be easily countered. As she paused by the parade field, her gaze swept over the formation. Every soldier standing there had witnessed her skill, her composure, and her courage. They had seen a leader who refused to yield to intimidation, aggression, or politics. That loyalty was her greatest strength, and the one thing Briggs could not take from her, no matter how hard he tried. The trap had tightened, the investigation deepened, and the storm was only beginning. Captain Leela Dawson had survived the confrontation, but the next challenge, career-threatening, politically charged, and far more dangerous than any battlefield, was now fully in motion. The following week on the base was tense, electric with anticipation. Every soldier, every officer, every member of the battalion moved through their routines with an unspoken awareness that something monumental was unfolding. Whispers of Captain Leela Dawson's confrontation with Major Keller and the subsequent investigation had reached nearly every corner of the base. Some soldiers were awed, others uneasy. All knew that Lieutenant Colonel Briggs' fury had not subsided. It had only grown sharper, more calculating. Briggs, packing his office with the methodical precision of a man plotting war, called in his closest allies among the senior officers. His voice, low and sharp, carried the venom of suppressed rage. "Dawson thinks she's untouchable," he growled. "She humiliated Keller. She defied me. She's turning the battalion against authority. We need to make this stop, and fast." A senior officer, cautious but perceptive, interjected, "Sir, she acted in accordance with regulations. The soldiers respect her. Any punitive action could backfire." Briggs slammed a fist against the desk, rattling papers and sending a sharp tremor across the room. "Backfire," he barked. "Do you understand what's at stake here? Allow one officer to defy command and the entire chain of authority crumbles. If we don't act decisively, every officer on this base will think they can challenge their superiors. I won't allow it, not while I am in command." His allies nodded warily. Briggs was dangerous, intelligent, and utterly ruthless when it came to preserving his perception of authority. He wasn't just fighting Dawson. He was fighting a precedent that could expose the vulnerabilities of his command. Meanwhile, Leela Dawson was fully aware that the political storm was intensifying. She had anticipated Briggs' moves, but she knew he would escalate beyond subtle threats. The colonel had access to resources, influence, and the subtle mechanisms of bureaucracy, tools that could destroy a career with a single memo, a single accusation. She prepared accordingly, documenting every interaction, preserving evidence and reinforcing her credibility among the soldiers. The next day, an order arrived that raised immediate concern: a special assessment of the battalion's leadership, scheduled for that afternoon. Leela knew this was no coincidence. Briggs had orchestrated a formal review under the guise of routine oversight, a calculated attempt to place her authority under intense scrutiny in front of senior officers. The battalion gathered on the parade field, the sun harsh and bright above them, casting long shadows that mirrored the tension building in the air. Soldiers stood in rigid formation, eyes forward, but whispers circulated like a hidden current. Many were anxious, sensing that the events of the previous week had set the stage for something far larger than any standard assessment. Leela arrived last, her uniform immaculate, her expression calm yet commanding. Soldiers straightened as she passed, admiration mingling with concern. They had witnessed her courage firsthand, but now the stakes were different. This was no longer a confrontation of physical skill. It was a battlefield of politics, authority, and perception, with careers, respect, and lives hanging in the balance. Briggs arrived shortly after, flanked by senior officers. His eyes flicked over the battalion, then to Leela, a storm of barely contained fury and calculated menace simmering beneath the surface. He spoke first, his voice carrying over the formation. "Today, we will conduct a full review of leadership performance within this battalion. Every action, every decision, and every instance of authority will be scrutinized." Leela's heart rate remained steady, her mind focused. She knew this was a setup. Every word from Briggs was designed to intimidate, to challenge her credibility, and to plant seeds of doubt among the soldiers. Yet she also knew she had the advantage: transparency, truth, and the loyalty she had earned through actions, not words. The assessment began with formal questioning, each officer required to account for their decisions and actions. Briggs' strategy was clear. He intended to corner her with questions, highlight Keller's injury as a failure in command, and manipulate senior officers into seeing her as reckless, even dangerous. But Leela was prepared. Every answer was precise, every explanation factual, and every justification rooted in regulations. When asked about Keller, she calmly outlined his aggression, the attempted assault, and the actions she had taken to protect both herself and the battalion. Senior officers listened, some nodding subtly, others scrutinizing her words, but none could find fault in her reasoning. Briggs' face reddened with frustration. His attempts to corner her with insinuations about morale and hierarchy faltered. He had underestimated not just her knowledge of regulation, but her ability to maintain composure under pressure, even in front of the very people whose opinions mattered most, the soldiers. At one point, he shifted tactics, attempting a personal attack. "Captain Dawson, your actions have emboldened the battalion, yes, but at what cost? If one officer can dominate a superior physically and gain admiration from subordinates, how do we ensure discipline?" Leela's reply was measured but piercing. "Sir, discipline is maintained through respect, not fear. Soldiers respect leadership that demonstrates competence, courage, and integrity. My actions upheld discipline, prevented harm, and ensured order. Authority is reinforced by truth, not intimidation." A murmur of approval swept through the battalion, subtle but undeniable. Soldiers who had doubted, feared, or merely observed were now beginning to understand something crucial. Leela Dawson was not only competent, she was extraordinary. Briggs' jaw tightened. He could see the tide shifting before his eyes, the subtle yet undeniable loyalty the battalion felt for her. And yet he was not finished. With a calculated glint in his eyes, he moved toward the final phase of his plan, casting doubt in writing. A formal report loaded with insinuation and bias had been prepared for base command, subtly implying recklessness, potential instability, and undermining of hierarchy, all without directly stating it. Leela, anticipating this, had already prepared her own documentation: eyewitness accounts, regulations, timelines, and even statements from soldiers who had witnessed the events firsthand. Every possible angle of attack had been countered with facts, evidence, and clear logic. She presented her documentation calmly when the report was circulated, highlighting discrepancies, omissions, and bias in Briggs' version of events. The senior officers reviewed the evidence, eyebrows raised, murmuring among themselves. Briggs' fury was almost visible, his hands tightening into fists. He had expected the narrative to fall in his favor, but the weight of facts, loyalty, and her composed presentation had turned the tables. Finally, the assessment concluded. The senior officers exchanged nods, discussing quietly before the lead officer addressed the battalion. Captain Dawson has demonstrated exemplary command, courage, and adherence to regulation. Her actions during the recent incident with Major Keller have upheld the integrity of this unit. Further investigation will continue, but her performance, professionalism, and leadership are beyond reproach. The formation erupted in subtle, disciplined applause. Soldiers exchanged glances, some smiling quietly, others nodding with relief. The tide had turned. The battalion's respect for Leela was no longer tentative, it was solid, earned through action and reinforced by truth. Briggs' face was a mask of controlled rage. His plan had failed. His attempts to manipulate perception, intimidate, and cast doubt had been neutralized by her preparation, composure, and the loyalty of the soldiers. He left the parade field silently, but the message was clear. The war was not over, but Leela Dawson had survived a potentially career-ending trap. As the battalion dispersed, Leela remained standing, eyes sweeping over her soldiers. She had faced not just physical aggression but the invisible, dangerous battlefield of military politics. And she had survived, not by force alone, but by skill, preparation, and unwavering integrity. The storm had passed for now, but she knew, deep down, that Briggs would not give up. His ambition and fury were relentless, and the next confrontation could come at any time, testing not just her leadership but the loyalty and courage of every soldier who had witnessed the events unfold. The battalion had seen her strength. The colonel had seen it too. And now everyone waited, knowing that the ultimate test was still to come. The sun dipped low over the base, casting long shadows across the parade field. The air was heavy with anticipation, the echoes of past confrontations lingering in the minds of every soldier present. Captain Leela Dawson walked among her troops, her presence calm, authoritative, and resolute. The week had been grueling, a test of courage, leadership, and political navigation, but she had survived every challenge, every trap, and every whispered threat. Yet even as the tension eased, she knew the final confrontation was imminent. Lieutenant Colonel Briggs, humiliated by the failed assessment, would not retreat quietly. He had tried intimidation, manipulation, and bureaucratic scheming, but Leela had countered every move. Now, the time had come for the ultimate reckoning, one that would decide not only her career, but the integrity of the battalion itself. Briggs arrived, his uniform impeccable, but the subtle tremor in his hands betrayed his inner turmoil. He was flanked by officers who had once supported his narrative, but the events of the past week had shifted loyalties. Whispers among the soldiers suggested that Briggs' authority was slipping, and the very foundation of his control was at risk. He stepped onto the parade field, the assembled battalion forming a rigid, expectant formation. Keller, still in a cast, stood slightly to the side, an angry shadow of the man he had been. Both men looked at Leela with a mix of bitterness, disbelief, and grudging respect. They had learned something crucial. She could not be intimidated, and she would not yield. Briggs raised his hand, signaling for silence. "This is the final review of Captain Dawson's actions," he said, his voice sharp but lacking the confidence he usually projected. "All relevant parties have been heard and the evidence has been presented. We will now determine the consequences, or lack thereof." The senior officer from higher command stepped forward, papers in hand. His tone was measured, deliberate, commanding attention. After careful review of the incident involving Major Keller, Captain Leela Dawson's response, and all related documentation, it has been determined that her actions were fully justified, in accordance with military regulations, and served to protect both herself and the battalion. Furthermore, her conduct demonstrated exemplary leadership under extreme pressure. A collective breath seemed to release across the battalion. Soldiers who had been tense, anxious, or skeptical straightened, some exchanging quiet nods of approval. Leela's eyes scanned the formation, meeting the gaze of each soldier with quiet affirmation. Their trust and respect were unshakable, a fortress built on courage and integrity. Briggs' face, however, contorted with rage. He opened his mouth to argue, but the senior officer's gaze cut through him like steel. "Colonel Briggs," he said, voice resonant, "any further attempts to undermine Captain Dawson or manipulate this narrative will be addressed with equal scrutiny. Her leadership is affirmed, and any challenge must be based on fact, not perception or personal grievance." Briggs' jaw tightened. For the first time, he realized that his schemes, his intimidation, and his efforts to control the battalion had all failed. The chains of authority he had relied upon to assert dominance were ineffective against truth, evidence, and unwavering integrity. Keller, still wincing from his broken arm, stepped forward hesitantly. His face was pale, eyes wary. "Captain Dawson," he muttered, almost grudgingly, I underestimated you. What you did, it was precise, controlled. You defended yourself and the battalion. I can't argue with that." Leela nodded, her expression composed but firm. "Major Keller, respect and authority are earned through action and integrity, not intimidation. Today, we've seen the consequences of that choice." The battalion erupted, not in chaotic celebration but in disciplined acknowledgement. Soldiers snapped to attention, saluting, some muttering quiet words of approval and admiration. Leela's leadership had been tested on every front, physically, politically, and emotionally, and she had emerged victorious. The senior officer addressed the battalion again. "Captain Dawson has exemplified the highest standards of leadership. Let this be a reminder that integrity, courage, and adherence to regulation are the pillars of authority. This battalion is stronger because of her actions." Even Briggs, standing stiffly, could not deny the outcome. The weight of the evidence, the loyalty of the soldiers, and the official declaration from command left him with no recourse. He turned sharply and left the field, his retreat a silent acknowledgement of defeat. As the crowd of soldiers began to disperse, Leela took a moment alone on the parade field. She looked across the rows of polished boots, the straight backs, and attentive faces. Each soldier represented trust earned, a bond formed through shared observation of courage and integrity. She had faced aggression, manipulation, and a storm of political pressure, and the battalion had seen her rise above it all. Her mind wandered briefly to the magnitude of the week's events. In less than 7 days, she had defended herself from a violent superior, outmaneuvered a manipulative colonel, and maintained the loyalty and respect of hundreds of soldiers. Each challenge had required precision, patience, and mental fortitude, and each had revealed something fundamental about leadership. Courage alone is not enough. It must be coupled with integrity, clarity, and unwavering resolve. A young private approached her, voice hesitant but respectful. "Captain Dawson, sir, I just thank you for showing us how to stand firm, for showing us what leadership really is." Leela placed a hand lightly on the soldier's shoulder. "You don't just follow because someone commands you. You follow because you trust your leadership to protect you, guide you, and act with integrity. That trust is earned every day in every action." The private nodded, eyes wide with newfound understanding. Around her, soldiers began to gather in small clusters, sharing quiet words of respect and admiration. Leela's impact had extended beyond the physical confrontation. It had touched the very core of their understanding of authority, courage, and discipline. Later, in the privacy of her office, she finally allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection. The tension of the past week slowly ebbed, replaced by a deep, steady satisfaction. She had faced every challenge: Major Keller's aggression, Colonel Briggs' political machinations, and the scrutiny of higher command, and had emerged not only intact but victorious. Yet she knew the lessons of leadership were ongoing. The battlefields of authority, respect, and integrity would always test her, just as combat had tested her in foreign lands. But now, with the loyalty of her battalion and the affirmation of higher command, she had proven something vital: that courage, skill, and unwavering integrity could overcome even the most formidable of challenges. As the sun set, casting golden light across the parade field, Leela Dawson stood at the center, a quiet figure of strength, resilience, and command. The battalion around her moved with renewed confidence, inspired by her actions, their respect hard-won and unshakable. She exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the week lift, replaced by a sense of accomplishment that only comes from facing danger, adversity, and treachery, and emerging unbroken. The battle was over, the victory was complete. Captain Leela Dawson had defended herself. She had outmaneuvered a manipulative superior, and she had earned the unwavering trust of 282 soldiers. Her leadership was now beyond question, her courage undeniable, and her legacy secured on the parade field where it all began.